Hey y'all, welcome back to another Pokemon Pocket video. I'm your boy Ben here, and we are in the final stretches. That's right, we are hours away from the new Mythical Island release that is happening at 1 a.m. EST. I don't know about y'all, but I have my hourglasses saved. I have my gold ready, and as soon as it rolls over, I'm ready to rip it. So what better way to celebrate just to see kind of how did the meta shape out, what did things look like, what things stayed on top before everything, and I mean everything, gets turned upside down. So go ahead, hit that like button, subscribe, click the notification bell button. We still have time to hit 10,000 subscribers before the end of the year. And without further ado, let's dive into the meta. With a big, and I mean a big tournament, about 1,500 players, we have still seen the rise of Pikachu. But however, there's always been different builds and versions of Pikachu to make it to the top, and out of 1,535 players to be exact, this build right here came out on top, took first place, and won. And so what are we seeing? We're seeing our Zapdos EX, we're seeing our Pikachu EX, we're seeing one version of Pincurchin, and we're seeing the Zebstrika line. So what does this tell us? It tells us that folks who like the Raichus and things like that, people are opting to make sure that you can't retreat. This line of Zebstrika, of being able to weaken your opponents down with either Zapdos or Pikachu EX, and then you're finishing things off with Zebstrika off in the bench line to get that extra point or two or whatever you need. And again, because it has a higher HP of 90, it can take a lot of hits. You know, it can survive one for the most part, and then it can easily retreat. And so I think this is very low to the ground, is kind of what we're starting to see with Pikachu, with the Voltorb and Electrode, but this one's opting out to attack the bench, and they ran very successfully, as this was the winner and going in 13-2. Coming in second place, whether you love it or not, one of the other big meta decks here is Mewtwo, and Mewtwo showed out in this event as well, and also in other tournaments during the weekend. And this build actually got second place in this huge tournament, and it's very interesting because we're starting to see again this idea of playing more basics in Mewtwo. And the interesting part here is that they split the baby Mewtwo and the Kangaskhan. The baby Mewtwo gives you high HP, it gives you that wall, you're able to retreat for 2, and so if you get your Gardevoir up, that's essentially one turn it takes to retreat while you're having your Mewtwo EX on the side. But they opted to go 1-1 with Kangaskhan. Now Kangaskhan is a very interesting choice because Kangaskhan still starts its role as a tank, but it also applies early pressure. And I think something that's probably interesting and could be noted here is that in mirror matches, you are now able to put that early pressure onto your opponent without having to wait, because all it takes is 1 energy to attack, whereas baby Mewtwo is really set up for just a wall because it needs 4 energy. So by adding in this Kangaskhan, I mean, yeah, you need to flip coins, but on average you're getting 30 damage, and that's pretty good, especially if they're mirrors or even Pikachus. They need the Giovanni, they need the extra turns to attack while you're just dealing easy enough damage and then being able to take everything out with your side drive and Gardevoir setup. Now, while we saw those two decks, the Pikachu and the Mewtwo decks, pretty much run rampant now in these tournaments, we're seeing they're starting to get their optimal builds. We do still have to take note that Charmander, the Charizard Arcanine decks are still going pretty strong. This list right here went 10-3 inside of a tournament as well, and so again, it's your standard line now that we're seeing. The idea of adding in more basics into your fire deck makes it more consistent, being able to pivot more. But what we're seeing is that the other decks are getting online faster than this right now. And so whether or not it's an option of what people are choosing or what people want to go with, it feels like there's more safety, kind of a sense, in your picks of picking Pikachu and Mewtwo rather than dealing with this, even though I think that this is a very great power pick against those two. Now, while the Pikachu and the Mewtwo decks were running rampant, like I said before, this deck made it into the top 8 of that huge tournament which is like fantastic to see. And after this deck, we actually have another surprising deck that made it into the top 16, which is sweet to see that there's folks who can build up innovation and creativity. So speaking on this deck, what we're seeing here is our Arbok and Weezing line with a splash of Wigglytuff to deal with corner where you can't retreat after being poisoned, or you have your Koga, so we know that that deals with things. And then having that Wigglytuff EX is kind of like your sweeper. You're having your opponent deal with 3 Pokemon. That is a lot of Pokemon to deal with. With a lot of these other decks, like the top meta decks, you necessarily only have to knock out 2 because you know that the Pikachu EX, you can take out that or take out the Zapdos and take out one of the basic mons. For Mewtwo, you take out the Mewtwo and you take out the Rogs or the Curly or the Gardevoir, right? Like, there are means of which you only have to deal with 2, but in a deck like this, your opponent has to go through 3 while getting damage, while dealing without having to retreat, while dealing with flipping a coin to wake up. This, in a sense of making it through to the top 8, shows its strength in that, because Pikachu hates the fact that it can't easily retreat, and that's why the whole deck is built around like the 1 retreat cost. And obviously you have the advantage when you're going against Mewtwo, which makes it great. And like, hey, maybe you get lucky and now Charizard can never attack because they stay asleep, and 80 damage per turn will knock it out really quickly. Remember when I told you that people were innovating? A Marowak Golem deck made it into the top 16, y'all. I couldn't say it again. A Marowak Golem deck made it to the top 16. I think this is really cool when we see this, because none of these, even though they're fighting types, you have your advantage against the Pikachu's decks, right? And then when you're facing against the Mewtwo decks, you're not weak. Like, it's neutral because all of these mons are weak to grass and not weak to psychic, so you're not really worried about that as if you were like running the champ or something like that. If luck is on your side, Marowak EX also knocks out Mewtwo EX in 2 coins. So that's pretty good to put them on the reel. Even if you flip 1, that's putting pressure on them. Do they want to take their shot at like you getting 2 tails the next turn? It really puts backpedal on them as well. The Brock here is pretty sweet. You can trick your opponent by like having 2 on Graveler. You have a Brock in your hand, you throw the Golem up, you put that on there, and Golem also knocks out Pikachu in 1 shot. It also knocks out Mewtwo in 1 shot, and you do heavy damage to Charizard. So when you're thinking about the big top meta threats and applying pressure and applying high damage on them, this deck is really, really sweet in doing that in both of the evolutions. And so now you're not necessarily worried about which one is my finisher, which one's not, because both evolutions in this deck have the firepower to deal with them. As we start to see like what other decks did well, like, hey, like I like playing off meta stuff, let's see that. Here we continue down here of thinking to ourselves, ooh, what else is happening? And this version of Marowak is only playing 4 basics, which can get you in trouble sometimes, right? Like you really want to be able to make sure that you have enough mons to play the game, because there can be instances where you're only drawing 1 basic and like you're in trouble. But this person went 9 and 2, and so they were able to pilot very well. And yes, you are seeing that correctly. There is a hand scope and a red card in this deck, and you're always thinking to yourself, how do I have room for a red card? Now you're asking yourself, how do I have room for a red scope? And we see that they have just 1 Giovanni and 1 Sabrina, so you're being very extra careful as to when you're playing your supporters, because you only have 1 of each, so using them only in those pivotal moments that will secure you a win. Right? I think there's a lot of times where people play Sabrina early on to like try to stall and do those things, but you're really using it here to secure a point. Same thing with Giovanni, you're using it here to get that extra break point because you're looking at red scope and red card. And I'm assuming by adding the 2 of them, you do not red card unless you use hand scope first. And this allows you, you know, like theory thinking, is it actually worth to play my red card? Because oftentimes or not, you're helping your opponent because they typically have a bricked hand, which is why there's so many cards in there. Or if you see that the hand scope, and let's say they have their stage 2 evolution, they have their basic out, they don't have their stage 1, they finally evolve into their stage 1, you know that you can then play the red card to slow that down. And so having that information is great. However, how does it actually play out when this is in reality and against random things online? Who knows? But this went 9-2, so I'm not going to knock it. Other decks that were sweet was this Dugtrio Golem deck. I'm telling y'all, like, Brock is trying to make this comeback, this last stand in the final hours, y'all. And Dugtrio is actually a great pairing for these high energy mons, because all it needs is just 1 energy for it to attack, and it deals 40. It will do 60 to your Pikachu decks, and if you flip heads, attacks don't work to this Pokemon. So that's like pretty cool. You have essentially a wall, and your opponent needs to be able to play around that with Sabrina with other things. Here you have your Golem tied with your Brock. You're getting that extra energy out to help accelerate into that. So essentially you just need 2 energy on Graveler, Golem on hand, Brock on hand, in order to just skip ahead on that 4th turn. You have Onyx here, who also benefits from having a Brock, and if you can start with an Onyx, like on your first go, you have the energy advantage. You put 1 energy on Onyx. That following turn, you play Brock, you put that 2nd energy, and you're already dealing 70 damage in the early game, and that takes care of really any typical basics, unless your opponents are playing Kangaskhan, but then you deal with it in 2, which is really nice. And so I kind of like this. They avoid the Giovanni here because they're essentially saying our Golem takes care of everything, and our Dugtrio will be enough to whittle you down, and we hope that we prevent you from doing damage to continue to whittle you down and frustrate you. So this is pretty sweet of being able to work through that, and the fact that it's able to contend. Like, that's also awesome. Another deck that has now just started to creep out is our Executor EX and our Venusaur EX deck. This deck is like pretty sweet because you're able to have your Executor, your front line. You're essentially saying you're going to knock out these 2 big mons. Can you do it? We're running our potions. We're running our heals with Erica. Like, can you outlive the amount of health that we are having? You're dealing with 2 tanks in that sense, and that's really, really strong. And like, even thinking about this deck and like the new cards that are gonna come out, like, you have your supporter card Leaf that allows you to retreat for 2. Well, that means Executor can retreat pretty easily. He only has a retreat cost of 3. He already has an energy out. Now he can do that. You have your Venusaur, a retreat cost of 3. You have Leaf, that's a retreat cost of 2. And then you take that out, right? So there's just gonna be some interesting pivot points here that will allow this deck to probably do well, which can be very scary to deal with a tank that is an Executor EX and a tank that's an Venusaur EX with its high HP and the fact that it can sustain with Erica paired off with it as well too. I don't know, y'all. That's kind of crazy. And we step into here with my favorite starter making some numbers, putting up some numbers in Blastoise EX. This is actually pretty sweet because the ideal here is that you are having your Kangaskhan's up in front. Both of them are your stall mons, and that can also do damage for you. You're trying to use Misty to ramp up as much as you can for Blastoise EX, and Blastoise EX with its Hydro Bazooka getting there, enough energy on there, you're dealing 160 and you're one-shotting every Pokemon except for Venusaur EX, which even through its heals and sustains, you take out in 2. So this is pretty big. I think the old Amber in here is to try to like do the fossil tech to avoid Sabrina and everything else. And so this is pretty good. Your main focus is building up your Blastoise. Pretty straightforward, pretty straightforward strategy. But in sometimes in like games like this, that's all you need, right? Like if you're in a tournament, like you don't want to like think too much. You just kind of want to know what your plan is. And like if that's the type of person you are, where you're like, I just didn't want to do one thing. This deck does this one thing and it does it well. Up next is this Ninetales Blaine deck, which was very interesting to me. They're going very aggro here with having just a Farfetch and Ninetales, and you have one Meowth here to help draw your pieces. You have your Dome Fossils to use as like around Sabrina, and you're having your Ninetales here to deal 120 damage with your Blaine. Now this deck went 7-3, and what my thoughts are on this is that there's no Rapidash, right? And like when we seen Blaine aggro, we think of Rapidash and Ninetales, but I think that you are running into situations where you are saying, okay, we're not seeing grass, so why run that? Why use, you know, slots to play that when I know that like my 120 will take out a Pikachu EX, my 120 will put Mewtwo EX on the back pedal, and so like let's just do that. We know exactly where our Blaine targets are gonna go. It's gonna go on the Ninetales. So we're gonna hit for high damage, and so that's interesting. I think that's a very interesting take. Because you are running 5 basics here, so like I'm not saying that there's no basics, but there's just less pieces to find, and what you're really searching for is that Ninetales. If you don't draw Ninetales, this deck does not work like at all. So I think the Meowth there is trying to ensure consistency, but the Meowth does go down. But since you're a no EX deck, you do have to go through 3 Pokemon anyway, so you're hoping that the 3 Pokemon are Meowth, Ninetales. And hey, if I'm outputting 120, 90 damage, that's a lot. And now the last deck that we're going to show off here is the Exeggutor Greninja Dual Energy deck with a splash of Wigglytuff EX. And this is really interesting because if you think about the energy curves well, because you have a finisher with EX, Exeggutor EX that only needs 1 energy, you have Greninja that only needs 2 energy, and you have Wigglytuff EX that needs 3 energy. And so when you're thinking about ways to attack and how you want to pivot, you have different means of energy, and therefore there's not one that's power hungry in that sense. So that feels pretty good. I think dual energy is tough to maneuver around because like the ideal of Exeggutor EX is that you want that grass energy to start attacking you right away. But even then, having Exeggutor EX as a tank until you do get the grass while you're setting up for your Greninjas, finding your pieces for your Greninjas, getting, you know, your Wigglytuff and on the energy there is pretty good. You do have the Ericas here for sustain. We might want to use that for Giovanni instead, but seeing as like they're looking for pieces in this, they found that to be better, which could be really cool. I think the cool upgrade to this deck that's going to happen with Mythical Island is that we're getting another Execute that allows you to get a grass energy from the energy zone with a colorless energy. So if you run only water in this deck, you'll be able to get a grass energy anyways, and that's gonna be pretty sweet. So I don't know, I'm looking forward to this with the new cards that are coming out. I've loved the combination of Exeggutor and Greninja. You're dealing upwards to 100 damage per turn, which sounds insane, and so I love it. I love it, and I just can't wait to see this do well. So yeah, y'all, that goes our last meta report before this new expansion, this new set release comes. I'm excited. I hope you are. Let me know what you thought of the decks. What are you willing to try out in this last day beforehand? Let me know what you've used to get your 5 emblems. You can use any of these. As you can see, these put up numbers as well too. Without further ado, y'all, we'll catch you on the next one. And the next time that we're here, we'll be ripping those new cards. Until then, y'all, peace.